The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the Springfield District Court. 7-year-old Sarah Mitchell sat rigidly in the hard plastic chair outside the courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing architecture surrounding her. She wore a navy blue dress that her mother had carefully chosen, not too formal, but neat enough to impress the judge. Sarah's light brown hair was braided perfectly, each strand in place, a reflection of her mother's desperate attempt to present her daughter as composed and well cared for. But beneath the carefully curated appearance lay a child screaming silently inside. Selective mutism had stolen Sarah's voice 8 months ago. It happened gradually at first, starting with hesitation in large crowds, then progressing to complete silence around her father. Now, even in familiar environments, Sarah's words seemed locked away in some distant chamber of her mind that she couldn't access. The words were there. She could hear them clearly in her thoughts, forming sentences, constructing responses. But the moment she tried to speak them aloud, her throat would tighten, her chest would constrict, and a wave of panic would wash over her. Doctors explained it wasn't stubbornness or shyness. It was anxiety so profound that her nervous system had essentially shut down her ability to vocalize. Her golden retriever, Buddy, lay at her feet with his head resting on her shoes. He was a 4-year-old golden retriever with a temperament that seemed almost human in its gentleness and intuition. 2 years ago, when Sarah's anxiety first began manifesting, a child psychologist had recommended an emotional support animal. Jennifer Mitchell had researched extensively before finding Buddy through a reputable trainer who specialized in anxiety support dogs. The connection between Sarah and Buddy had been immediate and profound. Where words had failed her, the presence of her dog succeeded. Buddy seemed to understand Sarah's silences better than any human could. He never demanded she speak. He never pushed. He simply existed beside her, a constant, warm, unconditional presence. Jennifer Mitchell sat beside her daughter, her own anxiety barely contained. She wore a charcoal gray suit that she'd bought specifically for today, wanting to appear professional yet compassionate. At 39 years old, Jennifer worked as a senior project manager at a tech company downtown. She'd worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, taking on increasingly responsible roles. But now, she wondered if her ambition had cost her everything. That was the central argument in this custody battle, that she prioritized work over motherhood, that her long hours and business travel had created emotional distance from her daughter. It wasn't entirely untrue. Jennifer had been driven by the desire to provide financial security for her daughter, especially after the divorce. She'd worked 60-hour weeks, traveled for quarterly meetings, and often brought work home. But what her ex-husband's lawyer conveniently ignored was that Jennifer had arranged her schedule as flexibly as possible when Sarah began struggling. She'd cut back on travel, arranged to work from home 2 days a week, and made sure to be present for every therapy appointment. She'd learned about selective mutism, studied it obsessively, and restructured her entire life around her daughter's needs. But none of that would matter in a courtroom. Lawyers didn't care about intentions or sacrifices. They cared about facts and documentation. And the facts looked damning. Jennifer's calendar showed 60-hour work weeks. Her business emails demonstrated her professional focus. In contrast, Sarah's father, Michael, had structured his career as a commercial real estate agent with seemingly flexible hours. He took Sarah on weekends, and on paper, he appeared to be the more available parent. What the legal documents didn't capture was the reality behind those weekends. Michael had a volatile temper. When Sarah wouldn't speak to him, he'd become frustrated and impatient. He'd demand answers, raise his voice, and create an atmosphere of tension that made Sarah's mutism worse. She told her mother through written notes that being with her father made her feel scared, and that her words got more stuck. The psychologist had noted that Sarah's selective mutism seemed directly triggered by situations involving raised voices and emotional unpredictability. Jennifer's hand trembled as she reached down to stroke Buddy's soft fur. The dog lifted his head and looked at her with those soulful brown eyes that somehow conveyed complete understanding. He seemed to know what was at stake today. This hearing wasn't just another appointment. This was the final custody determination. The judge would listen to both sides, consider the evidence, and make a decision that would fundamentally alter their lives. Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety so intense it felt physical. Her small hands were clammy despite the cool air conditioning in the courthouse hallway. She tried to eat breakfast that morning, but the toast had felt like cardboard in her mouth. Her mother had made her favorite pancakes with blueberries, but Sarah couldn't manage more than a few bites. The anxiety had started the night before and had been building steadily ever since. In the children's psychology world, there was a concept called trauma-informed care. Professionals recognized that children processing anxiety and trauma often needed safe spaces, predictable routines, and the presence of trusted figures who could help regulate their nervous system. For Sarah, that trusted figure was her mother. When Jennifer was present, Sarah's anxiety diminished slightly. The girl didn't speak, but her breathing was easier, her shoulders less tense. Buddy amplified this effect, his presence creating a cocoon of safety around both of them. As they waited, other people moved through the courthouse hallway. Bailiffs in uniforms carried files. Lawyers in expensive suits spoke to clients in hushed, urgent tones. A court reporter wheeled her equipment toward one of the courtrooms. The courthouse felt like a machine designed to disrupt lives, to separate families, to reduce human complexity to legal arguments and documented facts. Sarah wondered if the judge would be able to see past all that. Would he understand that her silence was a symptom, not a character flaw? Would he recognize that her mother's long work hours had never been about neglect but about providing? Jennifer squeezed Sarah's hand gently and leaned down to whisper, "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Just remember what doctor taught you about breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Buddy will be right there with you." Sarah nodded slightly, unable to do more. Her eyes remained fixed on the ornate wooden doors of the courtroom, doors that suddenly seemed to represent everything uncertain and frightening about her future. Buddy stood up on cue as if he understood they would soon be called. He pressed his warm body against Sarah's leg, his presence a living reassurance. At that moment, a court officer appeared and called out, "Mitchell custody hearing. We're ready for you." Sarah took her mother's hand on one side and held Buddy's leash firmly in her other hand. Together, they stood and moved toward the courtroom doors. Each step felt weighted with consequence. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The marble floor beneath her feet seemed to stretch endlessly. As they approached the doors, Jennifer whispered one final encouragement, and then they stepped through into the room where her entire future would be decided. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, a desperate mother fighting for her child, a traumatized girl struggling to be heard, and a loyal dog standing ready to provide whatever comfort he could offer. The courtroom was everything Sarah feared it would be. High ceilings soared above them, making the space feel cavernous and cold. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, creating an atmosphere of imposing authority. The judge's bench towered at the front of the room like a throne, elevated above everyone else, a physical manifestation of the power imbalance. American flags stood on either side, and a brass seal of the state hung prominently behind the judge's chair. The room smelled of old wood, leather, and something indefinably institutional, the scent of countless lives being decided within these walls. Judge Harold sat in his leather chair, reviewing documents with an expression that revealed nothing. He was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of making difficult decisions. In his 30 years on the bench, he'd presided over hundreds of custody cases. Some had been straightforward, many had been heartbreaking. He'd learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to listen to the facts, and to render decisions based on law rather than personal feeling. Today seemed like it would be another standard custody battle, two parents fighting over their child, each convinced they were the better option. Jennifer and Sarah sat at one table with their lawyer, Mark Richardson, a compassionate man in his late 40s who specialized in family law and genuinely cared about his clients. Sarah sat between her mother and Buddy, who lay calmly at her feet. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his usual friendliness replaced with alert stillness. Across the room sat Sarah's father, Michael, with his attorney, Price, was a formidable lawyer known for her aggressive tactics and her ability to exploit weaknesses in opposing cases. Michael wore an expensive suit and maintained an expression of concerned authority. He looked, on the surface, like the responsible father fighting to maintain a relationship with his daughter. Nobody looking at him would understand the volatility behind closed doors, the raised voice when Sarah wouldn't respond, the frustration that bordered on cruelty. Judge called the hearing to order. We're here today to determine primary custody arrangements for Sarah Mitchell, age 7. This is the final hearing on this matter. I've reviewed all previous testimony and documentation. We'll begin with opening statements from both counsel. Price stood with practiced confidence, buttoning her jacket as she approached. Your Honor, I represent Michael James Mitchell, Sarah's father. Over the past 18 months, we've documented a concerning pattern of parental neglect. Ms. Jennifer Mitchell prioritizes her career over her daughters. Court documents show she works 60-hour weeks, travels frequently, and maintains minimal after-school presence. A child requires consistent, available parenting. Mr. Mitchell has restructured his career to accommodate Sarah's needs, taking on a more flexible schedule specifically to maintain active involvement in his daughter's life. We believe Sarah deserves a parent who makes her the priority, not an afterthought. The words hit Jennifer like physical blows. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. It was a masterful distortion of truth. Yes, Jennifer worked hard, but everything she'd done had been for Sarah. Every sacrifice, every rearrangement of her schedule, every decision to turn down promotions, all of it had been motivated by love and the desire to provide security. Continued, warming to her subject. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have concerns about the influence of the emotional support animal. While well-intentioned, relying on a dog as a primary emotional regulator is not healthy child development. Children need human connection, not animal dependency. Mr. Mitchell is prepared to encourage Sarah to build more traditional support systems. This statement made Sarah's mother tense visibly. The emotional support animal wasn't a substitute for human connection. It was a bridge to it. Buddy had helped Sarah access therapy, had given her the confidence to work with her psychologist, had provided the baseline of safety that allowed her to function. But none of that nuance would fit into legal arguments. Mark Richardson stood for the rebuttal. He was thorough and passionate. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Jennifer Mitchell has not neglected her daughter. In fact, she has made extraordinary accommodations. She reduced her travel by 70%. She arranged flexible work schedules. She's attended every therapy appointment, every medical visit. Meanwhile, the evidence regarding Mr. Mitchell's temperament and parenting style suggests a pattern of emotional volatility that directly correlates with Sarah's anxiety. We have documentation from Sarah's psychologist indicating that her selective mutism worsened significantly after contact with her father. Objection stood. That's character assassination, not evidence. Sustained, Judge said, though his expression suggested he'd heard something worth considering. The hearing progressed through the morning with increasing intensity. Called witnesses. Michael took the stand and presented himself as a concerned, dedicated father. He acknowledged that he sometimes raised his voice, but framed it as normal parental frustration with a child who wouldn't cooperate. He painted Jennifer as distant and career-obsessed. He described weekends with Sarah in glowing terms, trips to the park, movies, activities, conveniently omitting the times Sarah retreated into silent terror when he expressed frustration. Then Jennifer took the stand. She spoke about her love for her daughter, about the nights she'd stayed up researching selective mutism, about the sacrifices she'd made. Her voice cracked as she described finding Sarah sobbing after visits with her father, the girl unable to articulate what had frightened her. Tears streamed down Jennifer's face as she, "Your Honor, I love my daughter more than I love anything in this world. I will always put her first." Cross-examination was brutal. "Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you prioritized your career advancement over your daughter, that you've spent more time in business meetings than with Sarah?" "I've rearranged my entire professional life." "That's not what I asked, yes or no." "It's complicated." "Yes or no, Ms. Mitchell?" The aggressive questioning continued, each answer twisted, each response used against Jennifer. The lawyer was skilled at making Jennifer's sacrifices sound like excuses. She made Jennifer's love seem like rationalization. Sarah watched her mother being systematically dismantled by a woman in a gray suit, and Sarah's anxiety spiraled further. Throughout the morning, Sarah's condition deteriorated. Her breathing became shallow. She developed a nervous habit of picking at her fingernails. Her small body trembled despite the warm courtroom. Buddy pressed against her legs, offering what comfort he could, but even the dog seemed to sense the increasing desperation of the situation. By midday, the tension in the courtroom had become almost unbearable. Presented documentation showing Jennifer's work calendar. She presented Michael's schedule showing his flexibility. She presented edited versions of emails that made Jennifer sound cold and distant. The law, it seemed, was on Michael's side. The facts, stripped of context and emotion, pointed to a mother who worked too much and a father who appeared more available. Judge looked increasingly troubled as the hours progressed. He'd seen this pattern before, the aggressive lawyer distorting reality, the sympathetic presentation masking darker truths, the legal system's inability to account for what children actually experienced behind closed doors. But the law was the law. Without concrete evidence of abuse or significant neglect, custody typically went to the parent who appeared more available. At 2:47 p.m., after 5 hours of proceedings, Judge announced, "We'll take a brief recess. I'll issue my preliminary ruling at 3 o'clock." In that 30-minute break, everything changed. Sarah's anxiety reached a crisis point. She couldn't breathe properly. Her mother held her, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed. And in that moment of desperation, Sarah realized something. The judge wasn't hearing the truth. No matter what her mother said, no matter what the lawyers argued, the judge was going to make a decision based on documentation and legal procedure. Sarah would end up with her father, the man whose raised voice made her chest tight and whose frustration made her words disappear. She looked at Buddy, at the dog who had been her anchor through every storm, and she made a decision that would change everything. When they returned to the courtroom, Sarah and Buddy were different. There was a quiet determination in the girl's posture, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Buddy seemed to sense it too. The dog sat alert, as if waiting for a signal only he could understand. Judge settled back into his seat. "Let me issue my preliminary ruling." Judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes as he settled back into his leather chair. The preliminary ruling was about to come, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath simultaneously. Sarah's tiny fingers dug into the edge of the table, her nails creating small indentations in the wood grain. She could sense what was coming. Children were often more perceptive than adults realized, able to read subtle cues in body language and tone that revealed truth beneath words. After careful consideration of all testimony and documentation presented today, Judge began, his voice measured and judicial, "I find that the evidence demonstrates a pattern of limited parental availability on the part of Ms. Mitchell. While her intentions toward her daughter appear genuine, her work commitments and travel schedule create significant gaps in consistent, hands-on parenting. Mr. Mitchell has restructured his professional life to maintain active, ongoing involvement with his daughter." Sarah's stomach dropped. She could hear her mother's sharp intake of breath beside her. Therefore, the judge continued, shuffling his papers, my preliminary ruling is that primary custody should be awarded to Mr. Mitchell, with visitation rights to Ms. Mitchell to be determined at a later date. Secondary custody will be reviewed after a 6-month period. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Primary custody. Her father. The man whose raised voice made her words disappear. The man who didn't understand that her silence was a call for help, not defiance. The man who would spend months criticizing her mother while Sarah sat helplessly, unable to defend her. Jennifer made a strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "Your Honor, no." "The preliminary ruling stands," Judge said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a door slamming shut. "We'll schedule a final hearing in 60 days to confirm these arrangements." Price stood and smiled, a cold, victorious smile directed at Michael Mitchell. Michael himself appeared relieved, already planning aloud about the changes he'd make, the new school he'd enroll Sarah in, the way he'd get her back to normal. As if Sarah's selective mutism was something to be cured rather than something to be understood and supported. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not physically. She knew that metaphorical breaking was a literary device, but emotionally, something fractured. She looked at her mother's devastated face, at the tears streaming down Jennifer's cheeks as Mark Richardson tried to console her with words about appealing the decision. She looked at her father, already shaking hands with Price, congratulating himself on his victory. And then she looked at Buddy. The dog sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that seemed almost human. In that moment, Sarah understood something profound. The adults in this room had been arguing about her for hours. They discussed her education, her needs, her future. They'd presented her as evidence in their legal battle. They'd made decisions about her life based on documentation and procedure, but none of them had asked her. None of them had genuinely listened to what she needed, what she felt, what terrified her most. Her mother had tried. Jennifer understood Sarah's anxiety, honored her silence, created safety. But even her mother had been too caught up in the legal battle to truly hear what Sarah desperately needed to communicate. Sarah's father didn't understand her at all. He saw her mutism as a problem to solve, not a symptom to respect. But Buddy understood. Buddy always understood. Sarah reached down and stroked his golden fur, her small hand finding the familiar comfort of his coat. The dog's tail wagged slightly, and he leaned his head against her leg. In that contact, Sarah made a decision. It was the most important decision of her 7-year-old life. She had spent 8 months in silence, had let her anxiety dictate her actions, had allowed others to speak for her and about her. But today, in this moment, with everything she loved at stake, Sarah realized something. She had a choice. She couldn't speak normally. Her anxiety made that nearly impossible. But she could communicate. She had been communicating all along through her silences, her withdrawal, her connection with Buddy. The adults just hadn't been listening in the right way. Sarah looked at the clock on the courtroom wall. It read 3:17 p.m. Judge was shuffling papers, preparing to adjourn. Price was packing her briefcase. Michael was already texting someone, probably already imagining his victory, already planning how he'd reshape Sarah's life according to his will. Sarah's mother sat frozen, processing the devastating ruling, trying to figure out what came next. Mark Richardson was whispering about filing an appeal, about requesting a psychological evaluation, about all the legal recourse available to them. But those processes took time. And during that time, Sarah would spend nights with her father. During that time, her anxiety would grow worse. During that time, her silence would deepen. Sarah reached down and tapped Buddy's leg 3 times. It was their signal. The signal they'd practiced hundreds of times. The signal that meant something important was happening. The signal that meant Buddy needed to be ready. Buddy's entire posture changed. He lifted his head, his ears perked forward, his muscles tensed with alert readiness. In his training, Sarah had learned that dogs could distinguish between dozens of different signals: verbal cues, hand gestures, body language. But the three-tap signal was special. It was reserved for moments when Sarah needed Buddy to help her access her deepest courage. Sarah's heart began to pound. What she was about to do terrified her. Speaking meant vulnerability. Speaking meant her words might be misunderstood or dismissed. Speaking meant breaking through months of protective silence. But not speaking meant surrender. It meant letting the adults decide her fate without her voice, literally and figuratively. She watched her mother staring blankly ahead, devastated. She watched her father texting with a smug expression. She watched the judge preparing to adjourn, unaware that he was making a decision based on incomplete information. Nobody had actually listened to Sarah, not really. They'd made arguments about her, but none of them had truly heard what she needed to say. Sarah's throat felt tight. Her anxiety surged like a tidal wave. Every cell in her body screamed at her to stay silent, to retreat into the safety of her mutism. The old fear, the familiar panic, rose up to stop her from trying. But then Buddy pressed his warm body more firmly against her leg. The dog made a soft, whimpering sound, not demanding but present, supporting, the physical anchor that Sarah needed. She realized something in that moment. Speaking didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to be loud or extensive. It just had to be real. It just had to be true. And she had something true to say, something that only she could say, something that the judge and the lawyers and her parents needed to hear. Sarah leaned down and whispered something quietly into Buddy's ear. The dog's tail wagged, and he shifted his weight, preparing to stand. Sarah took a deep breath so profound it seemed to draw in all the fear and anxiety and desperation of the entire day. Judge's hand was already moving toward his gavel. Sarah's mother was still frozen in shock. Her father was still typing on his phone. And Sarah Mitchell, 7 years old, traumatized and terrified but absolutely determined, decided in that instant that her voice, even if it came in the most unconventional way possible, was going to be heard. Her hands trembled as she reached for Buddy's leash. Her anxiety spiked to unprecedented levels. But beneath the fear was something new, resolve. Not despite her mutism, but because of it. Her silence had taught her to communicate in other ways, to understand nuance and emotion, to see what words sometimes obscured. She was about to show an entire courtroom that the most powerful testimony doesn't always come from words spoken aloud. The moment seemed to move in slow motion, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Judge reached for his gavel, the wooden instrument that would officially seal Sarah's fate. His hand was halfway to the gavel when something made him pause. It wasn't a dramatic flash of insight or a sudden revelation. It was more subtle than that. It was something in the air, a barely perceptible shift in energy that registered at the edge of his consciousness. In his 30 years on the bench, Judge had learned to trust these moments of intuitive hesitation. They rarely came, but when they did, they usually meant something important. He'd made a preliminary ruling based on facts and documentation, and the facts all pointed one direction. The law seemed clear, but something about this case had bothered him throughout the day. He'd watched Sarah's mother's devastation. He'd seen the girl's anxiety escalate with each hour of proceedings. He'd observed the way the child clung to that dog as if the animal were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. He'd noticed that Sarah hadn't spoken a single word all day, hadn't even attempted to communicate verbally. Her silence was profound and complete, and it contradicted something he'd read in the psychological evaluations on file. The evaluations indicated that Sarah's selective mutism was context-dependent. She spoke to her mother in private moments, though rarely and with difficulty. She spoke to her therapist occasionally, though only after establishing deep trust. But she was completely silent around her father and in situations that triggered her anxiety. The pattern was clear. Sarah's mutism was a direct response to stress and fear, not a generalized inability to speak. Judge had been practicing family law long enough to understand that courtrooms were terrible places for traumatized children. They were designed to intimidate, to expose vulnerabilities, to reduce human complexity to legal arguments. He wondered suddenly if the courtroom itself was preventing Sarah from accessing whatever truth might help him understand the situation more completely. He set down his gavel slowly instead of raising it. The motion caught everyone's attention. Price, who had been gathering her papers with the confidence of victory, looked up with mild curiosity. Michael Mitchell paused mid-text. Mark Richardson, who had been comforting Jennifer, stopped mid-sentence. "Actually," Judge said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded immediate silence, "before I finalize this ruling, I'd like to address one person whose perspective I haven't directly solicited." He removed his glasses and looked directly at Sarah. The little girl felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. Her anxiety spiked immediately. The judge was looking at her. The entire courtroom was now looking at her. Dozens of eyes turned in her direction: the court clerk, the bailiff, the court reporter, the attorneys, her father. She could feel their attention like spotlights, illuminating her, examining her, judging her. Sarah's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Panic clawed at her throat. But then Buddy shifted his weight and leaned more heavily against her legs, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. The dog's presence created a small bubble of safety in the overwhelming courtroom. "Young lady," Judge continued, his tone surprisingly gentle for someone of his judicial authority, "I realize this must be very difficult for you. I know you've been quiet throughout these proceedings, but before I make a final decision about your future, I'd like to give you an opportunity to communicate anything you feel is important. I understand you may not be able to speak traditionally, and that's perfectly acceptable. But do you have anything you'd like to share with this court?" The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Everyone understood the significance of this moment. This was not standard courtroom procedure. Judges rarely asked children directly for input in custody hearings. Most judges operated within strict legal frameworks that limited children's testimonial participation, but Judge had just stepped outside that framework. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Tears immediately streamed down her face. Michael looked momentarily confused, as if the judge had suddenly spoken in a foreign language. Price started to stand, already formulating an objection. "Your Honor, I don't think." "I didn't ask for your input, counselor," Judge said firmly. "I asked the child. Let's see if she has anything to communicate." Sarah felt her mother's hand find hers beneath the table, squeezing gently. Jennifer leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart. It's okay." But Sarah knew that wasn't true. It wasn't okay. It would never be okay if she didn't say something. The judge was offering her something extraordinary, a direct voice in her own fate. How many children got that opportunity? How many children were asked what they actually needed instead of having adults decide for them? Sarah's throat tightened. The anxiety was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, to retreat into the safety of her mutism. Speaking meant risk. Speaking meant vulnerability. Speaking meant that her words could be dismissed or misunderstood or used against her somehow. But not speaking meant accepting a future that terrified her. It meant surrendering her voice not by choice, but by default. Sarah looked at Buddy. The dog's brown eyes met hers with complete understanding and unconditional support. In that gaze was everything Sarah needed: acceptance, patience, presence. Buddy didn't demand that she speak. He just existed beside her, ready to support whatever decision she made. Sarah's tiny hand reached down and touched Buddy's head. She ran her fingers through his soft golden fur, drawing strength from the familiar texture. She could feel her heart pounding in her small chest, so hard it seemed like it might break through her ribs. Judge waited patiently. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He simply sat at his elevated bench and allowed Sarah space to process what was being asked of her. The courtroom remained utterly silent, even the court reporter's fingers stilled on her keyboard. Sarah took a deep breath. It was the kind of breath that seemed to pull in all her courage, all her determination, all the pain and fear and love and desperation she'd been holding inside for 8 months. Her small body trembled with the effort of preparing to speak. The judge leaned forward slightly, indicating his full attention. Jennifer squeezed Sarah's hand more firmly. Buddy pressed against her legs with steady, unconditional support. "I understand this is difficult," Judge said softly, "and I want you to know that you can communicate in whatever way feels right to you. You don't have to speak if you can't, but I'm listening. This courtroom is listening." Sarah opened her mouth. Her throat felt like it was closing. The panic was immense and all-consuming. This was the moment. This was the instant where 8 months of silence could transform into something powerful, or where she could retreat back into the safety of her mutism. She looked at her mother's hopeful face. She looked at her father's confused expression. She looked at the judge waiting patiently. And she looked at Buddy, her constant companion, her emotional anchor, her best friend. Sarah's anxiety was still there. It would always be there. But beneath it, something else emerged, something stronger, something that had been growing inside her all day long, building moment by moment, waiting for exactly this opportunity. She squeezed Buddy's leash. She tapped his leg 3 times. The signal, the sacred signal that meant something important was about to happen. Buddy's entire body tensed, ready, waiting, prepared to help Sarah communicate the most important truth of her life. And Sarah Mitchell, 7 years old, silent for 8 months, traumatized and terrified and absolutely determined, prepared to finally let her voice be heard. Not through words alone, but through everything she had learned to communicate in her silence. Time seemed to crystallize into a single, perfect moment. Sarah Mitchell raised her right hand with deliberate slowness, her small fingers trembling with the effort of overcoming her anxiety. Every eye in the courtroom tracked her movement. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keyboard, ready to capture whatever was about to happen. The bailiff sat up. Even the ancient courthouse radiator seemed to hold its hissing breath. Sarah's hand found Buddy's leg beneath the table. Her fingers made contact with the dog's warm fur, and she could feel his muscles tense with anticipation. He knew what was coming. In their months of training together, they had practiced this signal hundreds of times, sometimes to test it, sometimes in moments of genuine anxiety when Sarah needed to access her deepest reserves of courage. But this was different. This was the moment that mattered most. Tap. The first tap was barely audible, a soft contact that only Buddy and Sarah could feel. But it registered like a gunshot through her entire nervous system. She was doing it. She was actually communicating her need for help, for support, for Buddy's assistance in speaking the truth. Tap. The second tap came slightly stronger. Sarah's anxiety was still overwhelming, but beneath it grew something else, a sense of purpose, a clarity that transcended fear. Her mother was watching. The judge was waiting. Her father sat across the room, confused and increasingly concerned as he realized his victory was somehow being challenged. Tap. The third tap was firm and clear. It was the signal, the complete signal. The signal that meant Buddy should move into action, should use every bit of his training to help Sarah communicate something essential. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then Buddy moved. The golden retriever stood with fluid grace, his 4-year-old body executing the movements he'd been trained to perform. But this wasn't a show-off moment or a demonstration of obedience. This was genuine partnership, genuine cooperation between a traumatized child and an animal who understood her on a level that transcended ordinary human language. Buddy didn't jump or bark or make any dramatic display. Instead, he moved with purpose toward the front of the courtroom. His gait was deliberate, his trajectory clear. Every person in the room instinctively understood that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't a dog misbehaving or a child's pet acting out. This was coordinated, intentional movement. The bailiff started to stand, uncertain whether to intervene, but Judge held up his hand. "Let's see where this is going," he said quietly. Buddy walked directly to the judge's bench and sat down at its base, his eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was perfect positioning, perfect communication. The dog had placed himself between the judge and Sarah, not but supportively. He was making a statement without words. This child matters. This child's needs are important. Listen to her. The courtroom was absolutely silent. A pin could have fallen and everyone would have heard it. Sarah felt all the eyes on her now. The anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, to pull her back into the safety of silence. Her throat constricted. Her hands shook. Every cell in her body wanted to retreat, to go back to the way things had been before, when her silence protected her from judgment and misunderstanding. But then she looked at Buddy sitting at the judge's bench, his golden head held high, his brown eyes locked on hers with complete faith that she could do this. The dog believed in her. He believed that her words mattered. He believed that her truth was worth breaking through 8 months of protective silence to say aloud. Sarah's mother squeezed her hand. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered. "You're so brave, you can do this." Sarah took a deep breath, the kind of breath that seemed to draw up from the deepest part of her being. It was the breath of someone preparing to do something terrifying. It was the breath of someone choosing courage over safety, voice over silence, truth over protection. She opened her mouth. Her throat was dry, her voice was uncertain, but the words came out. Buddy knows Mommy makes me brave." The words were barely above a whisper, but they echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Sarah Mitchell, who hadn't spoken a complete sentence in 8 months, had just spoken. The court reporter's fingers moved frantically across her keyboard. Jennifer gasped and put her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face. Sarah continued, her voice becoming slightly stronger with each word, though still soft and trembling with emotion. "When Daddy yells, I can't talk. When Mommy holds me, Buddy stops shaking. Mommy teaches him to be brave, like me." Her words came haltingly, each phrase separated by a breath, but they were clear. They were true. They were devastating in their simplicity. Sarah paused, gathering strength for what came next. She looked directly at her father and, for the first time, made eye contact with him instead of looking away in fear. "Buddy chooses Mommy," Sarah said. "Buddy knows Mommy is safe." The courtroom erupted. Not with noise, but with visible emotional reaction. Spectators throughout the gallery gasped audibly. The court reporter wiped away tears while still recording every word. The bailiff stood with his mouth open, visibly moved. Several court officers blinked rapidly, clearly fighting back their own tears. Price stood up to object, her professional composure finally cracking. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Sit down, counselor," Judge said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, his own expression revealing that he was profoundly moved. He looked at Sarah with a gaze that combined compassion, wonder, and the kind of respect typically reserved for people who'd accomplished something extraordinary. In a sense, she had. This 7-year-old girl had just broken through one of the most powerful psychological barriers to communicate something essential about her own. Michael Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. His smug expression had vanished completely, replaced with confusion and growing concern. He looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, and what he saw, this determined, brave, terrified child risking everything to speak truth, seemed to shake something in him. Jennifer had moved closer to Sarah, her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Sarah was trembling violently now, the adrenaline from speaking crashing through her system like a storm. The 8 months of protective silence were breaking apart, and all the anxiety and fear and pain that silence had been holding back threatened to overwhelm her. But Buddy remained at the judge's bench, his presence a steady anchor. The dog's gaze never left Sarah, his brown eyes communicating absolute solidarity. Judge looked at the dog, then at Sarah, then at Jennifer. He looked at the documentation before him, at the psychological evaluations, at the work schedules and emails and legal arguments that had seemed so conclusive just moments before. "I believe," Judge said slowly, "that we need to take a substantial recess. I'm ordering an emergency psychological evaluation focused specifically on the impact of paternal contact on Sarah's anxiety and selective mutism. I'm also requesting a detailed analysis of the role of emotional support animals in her treatment and—" He looked directly at Sarah again. "Young lady, thank you for your courage in speaking today. This court will ensure that your voice is heard and considered in all future proceedings." Sarah felt her mother's arms around her, felt the overwhelming release of emotions she'd been containing for months. She'd done it. She'd broken her silence. She'd spoken truth to power. And Buddy, her faithful companion, remained at the judge's bench, a golden sentinel ensuring that the judge would listen, that Sarah's truth would not be dismissed, that the love between a child and her emotional support animal would be recognized as evidence of genuine emotional connection and security. The courtroom would never be quite the same after this moment. Judge Harold sat motionless in his leather chair, his hands folded carefully on the bench before him. He had not removed his eyes from Sarah Mitchell since the moment she spoke her final words. 30 years on the bench had taught him many things about human nature, about the law, about the complex intersection where legal procedure met human reality. But rarely, perhaps never, had he witnessed something as profound and honest as what had just occurred in his courtroom. The judge was a man of procedure and precedent. He believed in the rule of law, in careful documentation, in the systematic evaluation of evidence. But he was also a human being, and at this moment, his humanity was warring with his judicial training. Everything he had been trained to believe about the legal process, that facts spoke for themselves, that documentation revealed truth, that careful argument could clarify complex situations, had just been fundamentally challenged by a 7-year-old girl's whispered testimony. He looked down at Buddy, still sitting at the base of his bench. The dog had not moved since arriving there. He simply sat, his golden body perfectly still, his brown eyes occasionally glancing back at Sarah to ensure she was managing the overwhelming emotional aftermath of speaking. Judge realized something in that moment. The dog understood what the lawyers had not. The dog understood what the judge himself had almost missed. The dog understood that emotional truth and legal truth were not always the same thing. Documents could lie. Schedules could deceive. Arguments could distort reality. But a child's genuine fear, her anxiety, her desperate need to communicate truth through whatever means available to her, that was real in a way that no legal filing could capture. He thought about his earlier ruling. He'd been so confident in his preliminary decision, so certain that the documentation supported his conclusions. He'd looked at Jennifer's work hours and concluded she was neglectful. He'd looked at Michael's flexible schedule and concluded he was more available. He'd reduced a human being's love and sacrifice to a calendar, and another human being's volatility and emotional unavailability to a schedule. How many other cases had he decided in this same way? How many children had their fates determined by documentation rather than by genuine understanding of their emotional needs? How many traumatized children had been unable to speak, unable to communicate their deepest truths, and therefore had their cases decided without their input? The realization was deeply uncomfortable. It suggested that the legal system itself, a system Judge had devoted his entire professional life to, had significant blind spots when it came to understanding children's emotional needs. Jennifer Mitchell sat with her arms around Sarah, her entire body trembling with emotion. She was crying, but there was joy mixed with the tears, the joy of finally being heard, of finally having her daughter's truth validated, of finally having someone in a position of power recognize what she had known all along, that her sacrifices and love were genuine, and that Sarah's needs aligned with her care. Sarah was also crying, but for different reasons. The adrenaline rush of speaking had passed, and now she was experiencing the emotional crash that came afterward. 8 months of protective silence had been holding back a tsunami of emotion: fear, anxiety, sadness, confusion, the weight of her parents' conflict, the loneliness of not being heard. Now that she'd spoken, all of that was threatening to overwhelm her fragile psychological system. Buddy seemed to sense this. The dog's training as an emotional support animal kicked into high gear. From his position at the judge's bench, Buddy maintained eye contact with Sarah, his steady gaze communicating, "I'm here. I see you. You're not alone." His very presence was a form of emotional regulation, helping Sarah's nervous system begin to calm despite the intensity of what she'd just experienced. The court reporter sat with tears streaming down her face, though her fingers continued moving across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. She'd been recording court proceedings for 20 years, and she'd never encountered anything quite like this. Her job was to document what happened in the courtroom, but how did you capture in writing the emotional truth of what had just occurred? The transcripts would record Sarah's words, but they couldn't convey the courage it took to speak those words, the weight of the silence that had preceded them, or the way her voice had grown slightly stronger with each phrase. Michael Mitchell looked like he'd been physically struck. His face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles were white. He kept opening his mouth as if to say something, then closing it again without speaking. Occasionally, his eyes flicked toward his daughter, and what was visible on his face suggested that he was beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that his daughter was genuinely afraid of him. Price sat perfectly still beside him, her professional armor visibly cracked. She'd been trained to win cases, to argue persuasively, to twist facts in her client's favor. But there was no argument she could make that would contradict what everyone in the courtroom had just witnessed. A child's honest testimony that had cost her enormous courage to deliver, transcended legal maneuvering. Judge removed his glasses and set them carefully on his bench. Without them, he looked older and more vulnerable. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, a gesture that conveyed profound emotion and internal conflict. "I need to make a statement for the record," he said, his voice quieter than before but carrying weight. "What we witnessed here today has fundamentally altered my understanding of this case. I entered this hearing prepared to make a ruling based on documentation and documented patterns of availability. I still believe that documentation is important. But today, I've been reminded of something I should never have forgotten. The law exists to serve human beings, particularly those who cannot advocate fully for themselves." He looked directly at Sarah, then at her mother, then at Michael. "I was prepared to issue a preliminary ruling that would have separated a traumatized child from the parent she identifies as her primary source of emotional safety. That ruling was based on the assumption that I understood the facts of this case. But the crucial fact, the emotional truth that mattered most, had not been heard. That truth required a child's courage to communicate, an emotional support animal's loyalty to facilitate, and a willingness on my part to step outside normal procedure to listen." Judge paused, seeming to collect his thoughts. "Therefore, I am issuing a new preliminary ruling. Effective immediately, primary custody shall remain with Ms. Jennifer Mitchell, pending the completion of comprehensive psychological and behavioral evaluations. Mr. Mitchell will undergo court-ordered anger management training and family therapy before custody arrangements are modified. Furthermore, I am ordering that all future decisions regarding Sarah's custody shall specifically consider the role and impact of her emotional support animal, as well as her identified emotional needs and anxiety triggers." Michael started to object, but the judge held up his hand. "Additionally," Judge continued, I'm ordering that this court maintain ongoing jurisdiction in this matter for at least 18 months, with quarterly reviews scheduled to assess Sarah's psychological and emotional security. Sarah's voice, in whatever form it takes, will be solicited and genuinely considered in all future modifications to custody arrangements. The judge looked at Buddy again, and something like wonder crossed his face. I'm also going to note in my written opinion that the presence of the emotional support animal appears to have been instrumental in helping the child access her own voice and communicate essential truth about her emotional security. And this court recognizes that emotional support animals may serve an important function in family law proceedings involving traumatized children. Jennifer was openly weeping now, her hand covering her mouth as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Sarah remained safe. Sarah would stay with her mother. The fear that had been building all day finally released, flowing out in tears and trembling shoulders. Buddy, sensing that the crisis had passed, and Sarah's immediate need for acute support had changed, stood and walked back to Sarah's side, settling against her leg with his characteristic calm presence. Judge looked at the courtroom clock. 3:47 p.m. 50 minutes ago, he'd been prepared to make a ruling that would have devastated this family. 50 minutes ago, he'd been confident in his preliminary decision. 50 minutes ago, he hadn't understood the true nature of what was at stake. One child's courage, facilitated by one dog's loyalty, had changed everything. And Judge Harold, for the first time in his long judicial career, truly understood that sometimes the law needed to be guided by humanity. The courtroom erupted, but not in the violent, chaotic way one might imagine. Instead, the eruption was one of suppressed emotion finally finding release. Spectators in the gallery wiped away tears openly. The bailiff, a man in his 50s who'd worked in the courthouse for nearly 2 decades, openly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The court clerk stood and applauded before catching herself and sitting back down, as if suddenly remembering her professional role. News of what had happened traveled through the courthouse with remarkable speed. Courthouse staff who worked on other floors suddenly found reasons to visit the family law section. A local news reporter who happened to be covering another case that day heard the story and immediately began asking questions, smelling what would become a significant human interest story. Jennifer Mitchell held her daughter close, not wanting to let go, afraid that if she released Sarah even for a moment, this victory might somehow evaporate. Sarah remained pressed against her mother, her small body still trembling with the aftereffects of speaking and the emotional release that had followed. Buddy positioned himself protectively around both of them, his golden body creating a physical barrier between the family and the rest of the world. Michael Mitchell stood alone at his table, Price having excused herself to make some phone calls. He looked lost, confused, as if he'd suddenly awakened in a situation he didn't recognize. He kept glancing at Sarah, his expression complicated, part anger, part confusion, part something that might have been the beginnings of understanding. He'd come to court expecting to win. He'd come confident that the legal system would validate his preferred custody arrangement. Instead, he'd watched his daughter choose her mother, watched her use her very silence as testimony against him, watched the judge fundamentally alter the ruling based on a child's honest words. Over the next hour, several people approached Jennifer with quiet words of support. A courthouse security guard, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, squeezed Jennifer's shoulder and whispered, "You're a good mother. I could tell." A law clerk, probably in her late 20s, approached and said, "What I saw today was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. That little girl is extraordinary." Judge called for a recess that extended through the afternoon. He retreated to his chambers, asking not to be disturbed. His clerk later reported that the judge sat at his desk for nearly 2 hours, his face troubled, clearly processing what had happened in his courtroom. When he finally emerged, he asked his staff to begin research on how other courts had handled emotional support animals in family law cases. He wanted to understand the precedent, the potential implications, the broader questions his decision might raise. By 4:30 p.m., the story had made it to the local news station. A reporter named James, cousin, stood outside the courthouse with a camera crew, attempting to explain what had happened inside to evening news viewers. "An extraordinary moment in family court today," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "A 7-year-old girl with selective mutism, an anxiety condition that prevents her from speaking, broke through 8 months of silence to testify in her parents' custody hearing. The remarkable part, she appeared to signal her emotional support dog, who then walked directly to the judge's bench, seemingly advocating for the child's emotional needs. Her testimony led the judge to completely overturn his preliminary custody ruling." The story caught fire on social media within hours. Silent Voice began trending on Twitter. People shared the news report with emotional comments. "This child's courage is inspiring. This is what real advocacy looks like. This dog understands more about justice than most lawyers." But while the media attention was building, inside the courthouse, the human reality was more complex and painful. Michael Mitchell finally left the building around 5:15 p.m. As he walked past Jennifer and Sarah, who were waiting for their lawyer to finish paperwork, he stopped. For a moment, father and daughter made eye contact. Sarah immediately moved closer to her mother, her body language clearly communicating fear and discomfort. Michael's jaw clenched. He looked away and continued walking without saying anything. But in that moment, the reality of what Sarah had communicated became inescapably clear. His daughter was afraid of him. Not theoretically afraid, not in the way that could be dismissed as a child's irrational anxiety, but genuinely, deeply afraid. And his realization of that fact seemed to devastate him in a way that the judge's ruling had not. Price appeared briefly to inform Jennifer that Michael would likely appeal the judge's decision. She said it matter-of-factly, professionally, but there was something different in her tone now, a lack of the aggressive confidence she'd carried into the courtroom that morning. She'd realized something during the proceedings. She couldn't win this case. The facts had shifted from documentation to emotional truth, and on that terrain, her legal skills were insufficient. By evening, Jennifer, Sarah, and Buddy sat in a quiet conference room within the courthouse building. Sarah was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained from the intensity of speaking after so long in silence. She sat curled against her mother, her eyes barely open, Buddy's head resting on her lap. "You were so brave today, sweetie," Jennifer whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "I'm so proud of you." Sarah didn't respond verbally. Speaking had cost her enormously, and her voice needed rest. But she squeezed her mother's hand, communicating understanding and perhaps her own pride in what she'd accomplished. Mark Richardson entered the conference room with papers to sign. "Congratulations," he said, smiling genuinely. "You won. Sarah stays with you. The judge was very clear about that." Jennifer nodded, but her expression suggested that the victory felt more complicated than simple happiness. Sarah would stay with her, yes, but her father would still be part of her life. The custody arrangement would require ongoing litigation and modification. The emotional work of healing from this trauma was just beginning. Around 7 p.m., as they prepared to leave the courthouse, a woman approached them near the exit. She introduced herself as Dr. Walters, a clinical psychologist who specialized in family trauma and emotional support animals. "I was observing your daughter's case from the gallery," Dr. Walters explained. "What I witnessed today was remarkable. I'd like to offer my services pro. I believe Sarah would benefit from trauma-informed therapy, and I'd like to help your family navigate this transition." Jennifer looked at the woman carefully, then at Sarah, who had started to display anxiety symptoms again as her energy depleted. She nodded. "Thank you. Yes, we'd appreciate that." As they finally left the courthouse building around 7:30 p.m., evening had fallen. The autumn air was cool and crisp. News cameras were still positioned outside, trying to catch footage of Sarah as she exited. Jennifer quickly guided her daughter toward their car, Buddy walking steadily beside them. One reporter called out, "Sarah, how do you feel about today?" Sarah didn't respond. She was too exhausted, too emotionally depleted. But as they reached their car, she looked back at the courthouse building, her small hand still holding her mother's firmly. By 8 p.m., Sarah was asleep in her car seat as Jennifer drove home through the evening traffic. Buddy lay in the back seat with his head near Sarah, maintaining his protective presence even as the girl slept. Jennifer drove carefully, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with text messages from friends who'd seen the news, with congratulations and support. But Jennifer's thoughts weren't on the victory. They were on her daughter, on the extraordinary courage Sarah had displayed, on the pain her daughter had been carrying, on the long road to healing that now lay ahead. She thought about the irony of the situation. Sarah's selective mutism, her anxiety, her silence, all of these things that had seemed like obstacles to being heard, had actually become the pathway to making her voice understood in the most powerful way possible. By the time Jennifer pulled into her driveway at 8:47 p.m., her hands were shaking with delayed reaction to the day's intensity. She sat in the car for several minutes before attempting to get out, just breathing, processing, marveling at her daughter's courage. The day that had begun with terror and ended with victory was ultimately a beginning, the start of a new chapter, not just for Sarah and Jennifer, but for everyone who'd been in that courtroom and everyone who would hear about what happened there. 3 weeks after the courtroom eruption, Sarah Mitchell sat in Dr. Walters' office, a space deliberately designed to feel warm and welcoming rather than clinical. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, plants in the corners, and artwork on the walls created an environment far removed from the institutional coldness of a courthouse. Buddy lay curled at Sarah's feet, his presence already helping the girl access her emerging capacity to communicate. Sarah had spoken more in the past 3 weeks than she had in the previous 8 months. Not constantly. Her anxiety still created significant barriers to verbal communication, but increasingly. Words were still difficult, still sometimes caught in her throat, but they were becoming accessible. Dr. Walters explained to Jennifer that Sarah's breakthrough in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted something in her nervous system. The girl had discovered that her voice mattered, that her words could be heard, that communication was possible even through her anxiety. "How are you feeling about the upcoming custody exchange this weekend?" Dr. Walters asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then slowly she spoke, scared but less scared than before. It was a significant statement. Michael had completed the first 4 sessions of court-ordered anger management. His therapist reported that he was beginning to understand how his volatile temperament affected his daughter. The custody arrangement would give him weekend visitation with specific parameters. No raising his voice, no discussions of the custody conflict, a focus on age-appropriate activities. A court-appointed supervisor would be present for the first 3 visits. "That's a very brave feeling to have," Dr. Walters said. "Being scared and doing it anyway, that's courage." Sarah reached down and stroked Buddy's fur. The dog's tail wagged gently, as if affirming the therapist's statement. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the county courthouse, Judge Harold sat in his chambers reviewing the comprehensive psychological evaluations he'd ordered. 2 independent psychologists had completed separate assessments of Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer. The findings were remarkably consistent. Sarah's selective mutism was directly triggered by stress associated with her father's volatile emotional expression. In her mother's presence, Sarah's anxiety decreased measurably. Most significantly, the presence of her emotional support dog correlated directly with her ability to communicate and regulate her emotions. The judge read one passage twice. The emotional support animal appears to serve a regulatory function that allows the child to access her own voice. The presence of the dog creates a psychological safety that extends beyond the animal itself. It appears to communicate to the child's nervous system that she is safe enough to be vulnerable. Judge had spent considerable time researching how other courts handled emotional support animals in family law cases. He'd found surprisingly little precedent. Most family law existed in a legal framework that predated widespread understanding of emotional support animals, but he was determined to change that, at least within his own jurisdiction. On the morning of September 28th, exactly 1 month after the original hearing, Judge issued his formal written opinion on the Mitchell custody case. The opinion was unusual, far longer and more reflective than typical family law rulings. It included sections on the limitations of documentation-based decision-making in family law, the role of emotional support animals in child trauma and anxiety, the importance of hearing children's voices in their own custody determinations, recognition that the most important evidence is sometimes not admissible under traditional legal standards. The opinion included a direct citation to Sarah's testimony. The child's statement that Buddy chooses mommy and Buddy knows mommy is safe represented profound truth about her emotional that no documentation or expert testimony could have conveyed as effectively. Judge went further. He established what he called modified testimony protocols for traumatized children in family law proceedings. These protocols allowed children to communicate through emotional support animals, through art, through written communication, or through other non-traditional means if standard verbal testimony created barriers to their participation. The ruling made headlines beyond the local news. Legal journals began publishing articles about it. Child psychology organizations cited it in their policy recommendations. Family law organizations held seminars discussing its implications. 6 weeks after the hearing, Sarah attended her first supervised visitation with her father. Michael arrived early, clearly nervous. He'd attended his anger management sessions seriously. He'd read books about selective mutism and emotional support animals. He'd spent considerable time thinking about how his behavior had contributed to his daughter's anxiety. The visitation took place in a community center playroom, with a neutral third-party supervisor present. It was awkward at first. Michael didn't know how to interact with his daughter without tension, and Sarah remained wary despite her progress. But Buddy's presence seemed to ease the situation. The dog's calm acceptance of Michael suggested that perhaps reconciliation was possible, even if it would be complicated and gradual. "I'm sorry I made you scared," Michael said to Sarah, his voice careful and controlled, so different from his previous angry tone. "I'm learning that when I get loud, you can't talk, and I want you to be able to talk." Sarah looked at him for several long seconds. Then she nodded slightly and said, almost inaudibly, "Okay." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one built on understanding rather than fear. Back in the courthouse, Judge initiated a broader research project. He began reviewing his previous custody decisions, looking for cases where similar patterns might have existed, cases where children's anxiety might have prevented them from being heard, cases where emotional truth might have been obscured by procedural limitations. He realized with deep discomfort that some of those decisions might have been wrong. Not legally wrong, perhaps, but wrong in terms of what actually served the children involved. In November, Judge did something unprecedented in his courthouse. He held a special session bringing together family law judges, child psychologists, emotional support animal trainers, and advocates for children's voices in legal proceedings. Sarah Mitchell attended, along with her mother and Buddy. She wasn't asked to testify or perform. She was simply present, representing the reality that children's needs and voices mattered. When Judge introduced Sarah to the assembled group of about 30 legal and mental health professionals, he said, "This young lady taught me something I should have known all along, that the most important evidence in a custody case isn't documents or schedules. It's a child's. And sometimes, that can only be accessed by stepping outside traditional legal procedures and truly listening, in whatever form that listening must take. Sarah held Buddy's leash firmly, her small hand steady. She didn't speak. The situation was still too overwhelming for that, but her presence spoke volumes. By December, 9 months after the original custody hearing, Sarah had regained much of her verbal capacity. She still had difficult days when anxiety made speaking challenging. She still experienced symptoms consistent with selective mutism, though now understood as an adaptive response to stress rather than a permanent condition. But she was talking, at school, with her therapist, with her mother, increasingly with her father during supervised visits. Michael's relationship with his daughter remained cautious, but it was improving measurably. He completed his anger management course. He began individual therapy to address the issues that drove his volatility. He started taking parenting classes specifically focused on anxiety-sensitive children. The change in him was gradual and incomplete. He would always be the parent whose volatility had triggered Sarah's trauma, but he was genuinely trying to understand and change. Jennifer received a commendation from the county's Family Services Department, acknowledging her exceptional parenting during crisis and her advocacy for her child's emotional needs. But the most significant change was systemic. Judge's revised custody opinion became required reading in the county's legal education for family law practitioners. 3 other judges adopted his modified testimony protocols. A local university began a research program studying emotional support animals in family law cases. A nonprofit organization was founded to provide pro-legal services to families involving children with anxiety disorders and emotional support animals. On the first anniversary of the courtroom hearing, Jennifer, Sarah, and Buddy attended a ceremony where Judge presented an award to emotional support animals making a difference in families. Buddy was the first recipient. He stood on a small platform while the judge presented him with a framed certificate. Sarah watched the proceedings with a small smile. She still didn't speak constantly. Her selective mutism remained part of her, a reminder of the trauma she'd experienced. But she understood now that her silence had never been a weakness. It had been her pathway to finding her voice. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Sarah squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, "We're safe now, Mommy." Jennifer smiled through tears and looked at the dog who had made everything possible. Buddy's golden coat caught the afternoon sunlight, and his eyes held the ancient wisdom of animals who understand human beings in ways that transcend words. The courtroom had erupted a year ago, but the real power of that moment wasn't the drama. It was the quiet understanding that sometimes a child's silence could speak louder than any argument. Sometimes the most important voices are the ones we have to stop and truly listen for. And sometimes it takes a faithful dog and a brave little girl to remind us that the law exists not to serve procedure, but to serve people, especially those too vulnerable to speak for themselves. Epilogue. 5 years later, Sarah Mitchell graduated from elementary school. She gave a speech at the graduation ceremony, something that would have been unimaginable during her years of selective mutism. She spoke about courage, about learning to trust that her voice mattered, about the power of emotional support. And she introduced her middle school class to Buddy, the dog who had changed her life and inspired changes that extended far beyond her own family. Judge Harold attended the graduation. He sat in the audience, watching this confident young girl who had once been unable to speak, and he reflected on how one moment of human courage, combined with the unwavering support of a faithful animal, had created ripples that transformed not just one family, but an entire legal system's understanding of how to listen to children. The courtroom had erupted, and the world had been changed forever. The end.